5 years of war, more than 250,000 people have lost their lives. That includes 4,500 children in Aleppo alone. And what strikes me is we shed tears, but there are no tears here. He doesn't cry once. That little boy is in total shock. He's stunned inside his home one moment and the next.
The civil war in Syria is the worst humanitarian crisis of our time. We've all seen the horrific scenes on TV and social media, but how did things get so bad?
لك يا قلبي انت مين بدي اجيب المثل ابوك يا عمو دغيلك عواني انا ميتة ولا انت يا عمرك اخ يا عمو.
It all started in 2011 in the southern city of Deira, where there were protests following the arrest and torture of a group of school children who painted revolutionary slogans on a wall. The security forces opened fire on the demonstrators, killing several, which resulted in unrest, causing more protesters in taking to the streets, demanding President Assad's resignation. Fast forward 5 years, the civil war has killed over 320,000 people and left approximately 1.5 million civilians wounded or permanently displaced. The bombings in Syria have been targeting and destroying crowded cities. According to the UN, approximately 1.6 million people are internally displaced in Syria. In terms of refugees, over half of the pre-war population of 23 million is in need of urgent humanitarian assistance. It is estimated that approximately 5 million refugees have managed to escape across the border. 4.5 million of these refugees are spread in just 5 of the neighboring countries: Turkey, Jordan, Iraq, Egypt, and the 5th being Lebanon, which we visited to see firsthand the plight of the Syrian refugees. Brothers and sisters, imagine one day having to wake up and within the space of a few minutes having to leave your house and take whatever belongings you have, and then having to make your way across the borders of many countries, not knowing where your final destination will be. Imagine then coming to a country which is foreign to you with your children and your family and not having money or provisions to rent an apartment or to have a house, and then having to find somewhere to stay for your family which is safe and secure. Many of these Syrian refugees left Syria in that state. Their houses were either bombed or they left before the bombing started in their villages. And then they had to decide almost overnight where to go. Would it be Iraq? Would it be Lebanon? Would it be Turkey? And which country would let them in? And then they find themselves coming to these countries and having to find a charity or a camp that would take them in and look after them. And then once they get to these camps, we know the camps are overcrowded. There is many millions of people that are desperate, that are in desperate need of aid. And they come to these camps and they may be put together in a camp in a tent with the whole family, or they may have to be split up. And a story of this that we saw firsthand that I want to tell you is we went to a camp in the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon, and while we were there we were distributing some aid. It was part of the GLM winter project, and we noticed that as we entered the camp there was a tent which had been burnt down. You could see there was nothing remaining apart from ashes. So we decided that we would speak to or try and find, the previous occupants of this tent and to speak to them. And it turned out that it was a pregnant Syrian refugee lady that was living in the camp with 14 other family members. So we started speaking to her and we asked her, what had happened.
الحريقة نحن فقنا امبارح الصبح وقاعدين هون يعني على الشمس، نص الأولاد كانوا نايمين جوا ونص عم يلعبوا. من شوي بس هيك فتنا جوا ما مشان الأولاد يشوفون فايقين ولا لا، ولا الحريقة بوجهي. اللي قدرنا نطالع واللي
انت فتوا صدفة يعني؟
صدفة ايه، كنا باركين هون انه ما في شيء يعني الحمد لله. ايه ولا من الكهرباء اللي طلع
That fire burnt everything that she owned. And I'm talking literally everything that she owned. The only thing that she had left was the clothes on her back and her children's. One of her sons didn't even have shoes. Even his shoes were burnt in the fire. And we were interviewing the sister outside or behind the ashes, of this what used to be her home. And I asked her, how do you feel that now that you have nothing? I mean, before that she had hardly anything, and now, subhanallah, she doesn't even have a roof over her head.
الوضع المأساوي لا حول ولا قوة والحمد لله بس الأولاد سالمين وهيك.
So 14 members of that family were then again displaced between camps, or that camp and surrounding camps, and some of her children and herself and her husband and the other members of the family were just literally had to speak to local other refugees, and wherever the other refugees could put them up, they would do that. Subhanallah. Despite the hardship and the trials and tribulations, they still help one another out. They are still so giving, and when we go to these camps, they are so hospitable. They call us in and they offer us what they, coffee is expensive and sugar, and we know what it means. It means nothing to us, right? But it does to them, and yet they're so insistent for us to come into their camps and sit down and have a cup of tea or have a coffee. Subhanallah. Many of the Syrian refugees from Syria were fortunate enough to flee, not having suffered any injuries. But on the other hand, many Syrian refugees weren't fortunate enough to leave without any injuries. And we witnessed firsthand some of the injuries that these people had sustained. From chemical attacks, from people, I remember we met this brother who was blinded by the bombings. We met another sister that was both deaf and blind, and her husband was disabled. So she was deaf and blind and her husband was disabled. And I remember this one sister who was blind, and she was living with, I think, 4 or 5 children. She had to flee Syria during the bombings, make her way across the border to Lebanon with 5 children, and this sister is blind. And she described to us how they would hide behind trees and hide behind trees while the regime were bombing Syria. And then she described to us how she explained to her children that all the little belongings that they had, their documents and passports, were buried under a certain tree, and that if anything should happen to their mother, then the children should return to that tree to take the belongings and then make their way to Lebanon. Subhanallah. Imagine having to have that conversation with your children, brothers and sisters. And it was one of the most heartbreaking stories I've ever heard firsthand in all my time visiting Lebanon and Turkey.
أمنيتك أنت للمستقبل أنت وعائلتك شو بتتمنى يحصل؟
أمنيتي إن سوريا ترجع على السلام ونرجع للبلد.
They all have one thing in common. They all want to return to Syria. Nobody wants to stay in Turkey. Nobody wants to stay in Lebanon. They're all waiting for the day that the war is over and that they can return back to their homes. At the moment, that seems like a very, very long way away. But this is their hope, and this is what they wish for. You need to know that living in these Western countries where we are so safe and secure, and we feel that no hardship would ever come upon us. Well, the Syrians used to feel that way. When we speak to the Syrians, they felt that they never thought in their wildest dreams that they would be going through this. But for them, this is the reality. And as a task force, we're trying to do what we can to raise funds to help these Syrian refugees. And we want every single one of you to get involved. And even if that means just by spreading the awareness, just by sharing this video, sending it to your contacts, and if you can, please donate. Donate from the bottom of your heart, brothers and sisters, because nobody ever went poor from giving. Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.